generations, the whole okay boomer thing. And yet, in many respects, younger generations and leaders in particular seem to be making mistakes that older generations didn't make. Part of that is probably the context of the world we live in, but in particular, I'm thinking about some of the maybe lack of self control that many of our Christian leaders seem to have when it comes to technology and internet. And maybe this is just like a bigger question about what we should need to expect from mentors and people who are ahead of us in the Christian life. So that was how to introduce the topic. Joe, you had some big picture thoughts about what mentorship should look like. So why don't you maybe
Yeah,
spin a yarn
I
on that?
suppose one of the reasons I've been reflecting on this of late. I mean, some of it is you're growing up. I'm 43. Wyatt is not 43. He's
22.
young and he's getting there. But one of the things I think I've experienced in life, and I think is fairly common to experience in life, is that as you grow, as you move through your 20s and your 30s and your 40s, and I'm sure this will continue into your 50s and such, um, is that you have to you rely but rely increasingly less on the external supports of mentors in some way. And that's not just because you're individuating in a sense. It's also because the way your life works, the complexities of life, you actually figuring out who you are, what you think, and what you believe. You work through the thoughts and opinions of many mentors, and again, you continue to do that even as you grow. But part of what's going on is there's itches in you. There's parts of your thoughts or of your life that aren't quite scratched, or there's just mentors that are unavailable, and mentors, as it turns out, hint, hint, warning to all the youngins out there. No, I'm still young, but mentors are also sinful and very limited. And one of the things that's hard to experience in life, but that you will almost inevitably experience in life, is that deep trusting mentorships will also include moments and maybe even very difficult moments of disappointment and fracture, of loss, those sorts of things. And what I see, I think, sometimes happening in this kind of generation, boomer, Gen X, millennial, Gen Z kind of discourse, is this sense that we've been really, algebra X, not Gen X, the Gen, but generation whatever has been screwed over by previous generation because what was unavailable to them is blah 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 blah. And there's part of me that looks back on that, and there's a bunch of little things I could pick out and say, sure, that's true, that's true, that's true. Yes, there's limitations here. Yes, that's disappointing. And yet I'm not sure that we're not naming something that has been true for at least 6 to 8, 10 generations of just given pace of change in human history and all those sorts of things. I'm not sure we're identifying anything that isn't actually fairly normal. And there can be your disappointment level, the degree to which you feel this degree of impoverishment or something like that, right? Can also reflect, I think, some degree of entitlement about what you should be able to expect from a generation. So, in one sense, I'm putting together thoughts about mentorship. What can you expect from mentors? And at what point do you have to say, okay, I didn't get everything I wanted from mentors. I actually have
Right.
to learn to be wise, internalize wisdom, walk on my own 2 feet. And how does that work in relating to previous generations as well? And the last thing I'll say about that is, I think what it also forecloses in our imagination, and this is really what your prompt at the beginning gets at, Wyatt, is that there's also virtues, even if we have virtues, and I do think that's true, even if we possess some virtues that were less common than a previous generation in some ways, especially if you as you extend across several generations. It's also the case that it goes the reverse. It's also the case that the previous generation possessed civilizationally useful, Christianly good virtues that you and your fellows, and actually most churches, have declined in as well, even conservative and Orthodox churches.
Yeah.
And the text I would give everybody, this is a controversial thing to say, but everyone likes Bill Burr. We're allowed to like Bill Burr as like a stand-up comedian, right? He kind of he understands both the right and the left and whatever. But don't watch this. It's bad. But if you yeah, but if you are a consumer of very well written culture, The Netflix show F is for Family, which is about a working class family in the 70s, is for those who have the threshold for it, and I'm not recommending that you do, I'm just mentioning it. It is an excellent text portraying a boomer in the early 70s raising a working class family in the Rust Belt. And one of the things that it does very well, and I think it makes it a brilliant piece of interpreting American culture, is it points out everything that was wrong with that era with deep poignancy, but it also points out everything that was right with it that we do not possess.
Mm-hmm.
And as a text, then I think it's very
Right.
fascinating for a conversation like this. You feel both challenged by it and also like, well, I'm glad I don't live then.
Well, there's always something to every generation too that looks at a prior leadership generation and critique. So you have millennials and younger Gen X's would look at the boomers and say they were too strict, too unloving, blah blah blah. And as a response, you have millennials and maybe younger Gen X going, we're gonna parent differently and do gentle parenting. And then you have Gen Z looking at older millennials and younger Gen X who are like the leadership class for them, and they go, oh well, these guys were too weak in this way, or they need to be stronger in that way. It's a bit of a pendulum, and I think there is some, and then what ends up happening is you sort of have all these like okay boomers or okay, I don't know if okay,
Yeah.
however Gen Z makes fun of millennials, I have
So
no clue.
So the trick I'm learning is that Boomer bad, Gen X good, Millennial bad,
Right.
Gen Z good.
Okay. Those
This
are the
is the
categories
taxonomy of good and evil in the webosphere,
on the webosphere,
on the interwebs. That's right.
and I think a big part of it is it's what we're expecting of people. No one's perfect. Everyone's a creature of
Right.
their time, and there are actual Bible verses. Like I just think of at the end of First Peter, in the same way, you who are younger, submit yourself to your elders. All of you clothe yourselves with humility toward one another, because God opposes the proud, but shows favor to the humble. That's sort of a perennial command there for younger and older people. The humility towards one another isn't just something that's true for them but not for us. You think of other Bible verses like that: gray hair is a crown of splendor, etc. There's all sorts of these sorts of Bible verses, and I think there's probably something for us to think through. What should we really expect of our mentors, and what happens when they disappoint us, as you said. I think instead of going okay boomer or cringe millennial, or I don't even know, does Gen X have a negative stereotype? Who knows? Maybe they're
No.
perfect.
You're good. They're good.
They're perfect.
Yeah.
Okay.
They've been yeah.
I think Zoomers are often criticized by older generations as being like unable to handle conflict and talk to people. Like there's all these
Right.
things that I hear, and I just go, yeah, we're all kind of creatures of our time. We probably have strengths and weaknesses, but especially if you're the younger person looking backwards, there are things to learn. I would say one thing that baby boomers were a little bit known for is the sort of independence. So if you're 18, move out of my house kind of thing. And part of that doesn't really make sense today. But then you might say the sort of the Zoomers are kind of known for being highly dependent on others, and maybe in ways that they need to learn from one another. And I think for me, it's almost a question of the biblical virtue of sort of self-control when it comes to speech. You don't have to just say someone's purely bad and someone's purely good, or they've purely ripped me off or whatever. You have to have a modicum of self-control so that your speech is measured. You can say what was helpful, what wasn't, because nobody's purely bad or good when it comes to these generational categories, given the diversity of thought. And I think that it makes you a bit more of a balanced person, because there is a huge danger that I notice, and I think you probably notice too, that happens like this. The prior generation of leaders or whoever made this big mistake, and therefore they ruined my life, and I am now bitter towards them. And so what I'm going to do is mock deride them and give in to my despair. And despair is not a virtue, it's a vice, actually. Because despair, at least in the more classical way of thinking about despair, is the sort of intentional lack of hope.
Yeah. It's the opposite of hope,
Yeah. But
which is
it's often more, it's like not even allowing yourself to hope. It's sort of
Yeah.
like the choice
It's
not
the
to.
death of hope. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And I think that's
Murder of hope.
significant. Everyone knows that it's really easy to focus on how bad things are and be in the mire of despond, to be like a puddle glum on 10 times speed. It's easy because it feels oddly good, but it's not the good kind of good. It is more the satisfaction of the passions and desires of the flesh kind of good, and that end is death.
And the removal of my own agency kind of good.
Yeah,
Because
you give up responsibility.
yeah, the more that I'm a victim and the more my identity becomes framed as the identity of a victim of the generations or whatever, then I'm able to kind of project and scapegoat out my real problems over to there. And as long as then I go murder them, my problems go away. And my agency is never has to be activated. That's an interesting comment. It's fascinating that in a lot of the rhetoric that's floating around, there's this sense that we've lost the honor of our fathers, honor your fathers and all these sorts of things, right? And it feels to me often, and I'm not saying that I'm an exception to this. I'm sure I've done this,
Mm,
but you can speak eloquently about honoring your abstract fathers in the past and your quote quote heritage that you've built up in your mind, and you're probably not very an accurate representative of the heritage anyway.
mm,
But forego the very obvious respect you owe to immediate fathers that are concretely and phenomenologically right in front of you. And I've actually seen this more or less overtly justified. Yeah, of course we're supposed to honor our fathers, but, and there's kind of a but with these guys. And I think there's a parallel that you see in the academic community as well. We know that there's been an impoverishment in certain ways, and in various elements of institutional learning, and especially in certain Protestant contexts in the last 100 years. And yet, that doesn't mean there haven't been very active, good scholars building up knowledge generation by generation. Now, it's flawed. A lot of it winds up being flawed, but it's flawed in a way that leads toward further and further precision. And so it's like, now, by the time you're one of these new guys, it's like, well, Richard Muller's kind of old hat. Well, I guess he's cool. Or Michael Haken. It's like, well, yeah, I guess he's cool. He was cool in his day. But you see this sense of this almost dismissiveness toward, well, like, yeah, we already all know that. And where they have errors, then it's like, well, you're not a very careful reader of texts, which is sort of like telling dad, who has built an incredible log cabin that you're now standing on top of, hey, you missed a spot. You're not a very good carpenter. You're not a very good house builder. That kind of attitude. And and I think getting to that question then of like, what should you expect? And I think we need to make two: what do we want, and what should we be content with? I think is the tension there. What
mm.
we want is as big as the human desire and horizon for desiring. We're made for God. And so, what we genuinely want out of our parents and our spouses in every relationship, what we really want, and it's okay to say this out loud, what we really want is perfect relationships. We really want perfect parent. We really want our mom and our dad and our spouse and our whatever. Like, there's something human in us that would really delight in perfect relationships in all of those ways. And yet, what the scripture then says, it's only God that's that. All relationships are disappointing on that vector. And then, what are we able to say? What should you be content with? Well, you should be content with, you should be actively grateful for the, attentive to, actively, not passively, but actively grateful for all that you've been given. You don't have to lie about what's disappointing, and you build upon it. And I think maybe this comes for me from the, I'll throw this back to you, Wyatt, but maybe this comes for me from the, I think of this sometimes in terms of like disappointment and a contentment in fatherhood. And I've had a biological and a stepfather. And I could speak all my biological father left when I was very young. And so there's sort of a zero of investment on the biological father side. And then I have a stepfather, and I could talk all day long about like, okay, well, here, he didn't do this, he didn't do that. Here's a couple things that I have plenty of gripes that are human gripes, perhaps you could say. Hopefully he's not listening to this, but that's okay. I think he knows. He would be fine hearing this, I think, actually. But what I then say is like, but that doesn't mean he didn't do this, this, and this.
Right.
Now, the difference between offering 4 units of talent and 1 million units of talent is a lot. But the difference between offering 0 level in talents and 4 levels of talents is infinite. The difference
Mm,
between 1 and 5 is 4, but the difference between 0 and 1 is infinite. And I think the gratitude the New Testament directs us toward is to be attentive to that movement, every movement in others between 0 and 1, and to genuinely be the hearts that receive what God has given you through them. And that puts you in the right position then to think through your disappointments and attitudes toward your mentors and your previous generations, your fathers, your pastors.
I like how serious it was, but I do want to show you a very interesting comment that we had on YouTube. They said real ones know that it's the
Yeah, it's the
millennials that are
millennials
the
that are the
problem. It's
pro.
I
Wait, is that it from our chat?
yeah, from
Oh,
like I
all
guess our
right. Well,
YouTube.
I
So
like. Thank you, whoever that was.
yeah,
You
I
did make
just
that.
have to say that's completely wrong. Millennials are the greatest generation that ever lived.
Well,
Um.
the senior millennials, we're
Oh,
kind of
okay.
like the first, like the ones that are more infected by Gen Z. They kind of
They get worse and worse on the
yeah,
way
yeah,
down. I gotcha.
exactly, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, there is something to this disappointment. There is something to, I think, bitterness and despair. One of the realities of life, though, is if in your teens, 20s, and 30s, dig your trench around everyone above me is the worst, you're not gonna have success in life because the people who are typically ahead of you in life are the generation that you're criticizing. And what's invariably going to happen is you're going to lead people who like you into doing the same thing. So what happens when you're now the generation that is the target of criticism? I think there is something you mentioned. I think we're talking about gratefulness. I think that's what you were saying earlier.
Yeah,
I actually think gratitude, just gratitude for life, gratitude for the good that you can genuinely recognize. And there is always bad, by the way. But if you, it's kind of like you walk into a room, you can focus on the bad for sure. But gratitude is actually a really key virtue in the Christian life. Thankfulness, gratitude, humility. Humility as being defined as thinking of others better than yourself in the way that in the Bible verses that I'm thinking of.
yeah.
There's something to that I think protects you against not only wild disappointment in life when you don't achieve what you think you ought to achieve because everyone's the worst and I'm the only one who has the ideas right. Look upon me and wail in terror and all this. But it not only protects you from that, but I also think it gives you the sort of um, strength to move through life without falling into despair. I think thankfulness is a huge and an important Christian virtue that we don't often think. And again, I know I've mentioned this before, but I think a third one to mention here is again it's self-control. I think when you look at the Bible and it talks about the fruit of the Spirit, self-control is there almost always, and it's almost always in the virtue list. Self-control or something very similar to it.
Yeah.
And there is a real sense in which I think social media and digital media and the internet has accelerated the ability to communicate in such a way that you, instead of having the reflection that real life creates in you, or the pause in communication that letter writing or phone calls created in us in the 80s, we don't have that anymore. And what ends up happening is that we impulsively react or tweet or TikTok or whatever people do. And it's interesting to me that if you look at, like, say, the anthropology that something like Second Peter brings out, is the contrast there is between like a true knowledge of Christ and living by instinct that the false prophets are proclaiming. And you live by instinct to the point that Peter says that you're a unthinking animal. And it's eloga, I think, what is it? Something like eloga zoe. You're an irrational animal. And it says that you actually, while promising freedom, these false teachers, while they promised freedom, they actually became enslaved to the very passions that promised freedom. In the context, it's licentiousness, sexuality, and so on. I'm applying that broader. I mean, Jesus says as well, I think in John 8, the person who sins is a slave of sin. I think the freedom to say what you want without consequences, especially online, about your prior generations, whether they're boomers or whatever, is something that feels good in the moment, but its fruit actually can be despair and bitterness, which isn't good for your heart. because it makes you sort of run on this sort of octane of frustration and anger. You'll burn out. Invariably, you'll burn out. Hope is hope and love don't burn out. They're like high
Yeah,
octane fuel forever, if that makes
and
sense.
it will burn you because the next generation, you reap what you sow in a sense, and the next
You reap
generation is
what you
going to
sow.
wind up relating to you in the same way, and you don't want that. If you cultivate an attitude of deep gratefulness toward those who gave to you what they had, and then you build upon it, then you're going to be well suited to be in a relationship when, as you should desire, your mentees go beyond you and know things that you don't, and move on in insight and wisdom where they're not embittered to you because they had to figure out some things for themselves. That sort of thing, and that's a healthy relationship between the generations. Um, on the idea of gratitude, yeah, I think we perhaps underthink the extent to which gratitude is just one of those deepest. Romans 1, right? It's like they didn't acknowledge him to be God or give him thanks. It's like it's almost the opposite of envy in scripture. To go seize what I want that I don't have when I shouldn't go do that is the opposite of this deep sense that I've been given so much. And what is required for again, our souls are so big. This is the whole tradition. Our souls are craving massive souls that are meant for God. And if you don't feed them the food, if you don't, just as with your body, if you feed your food, if you feed a bunch of junk food to yourself, there's not even the room to put the healthy food in. There, in your soul, if you're just you have an attention span, you have a certain amount of things you can attend to every day, and if what you do is attend to negativity and not negativity in the abstract, but like resentment and these sorts of things, and what you don't say is mostly I am grateful. Like I am just so grateful for, and I'm not preaching to the choir here. I'm preaching to me. I am, I'm a sinner in this area, but I do know through experience as well, and from the scriptures that to the extent that I've ever really practiced the habit, really actively said, God, I'm going to sit down and genuinely name what you have done for me and all the little things that you've blessed me with. That's like having a spiritual meal. You're literally filling your soul with things. And this is where that self control comes from, so that when those other things come, the degree of health in the soul, the degree of tranquility and calm in the soul through the nourishment that it has received, um, gives you the resilience to be able to handle those things that would otherwise make you lose your cool. And again, I don't speak here as any particularly virtuous man. I mean, people who know me know that I can, I've flown off the handle before, and nevertheless, this is the way to deal with self control problems. And it's interesting. In Second Peter and in in Galatians 5, what's fascinating to me is you have it pulled up for us. They come in opposite order. In Second Peter, self control is very emphasized on the front side, but we're gonna. In fact, I'll just look at this list here with you. It's fascinating that self control is the last thing in the fruits of the spirit. And feel the movement. I'm going to read them out loud here. Feel the movement between the kind of the movement of God inside of you and then your movement outside of yourself in the fruits of the Spirit. So the fruit of the Spirit is love, and you think of the love of God, the joy that gives you, the peace that you have from having that joy. Where are we? Yes. What would that do to me immediately? Well, I'd begin to move out of myself and be a bit more patient, and that's a passive thing. Now look at this next one, kind. Now I'm not just patient, I'm kind of moving out of myself. Goodness. Now I'm really moving up. Faithfulness. Now I'm regularly moving out of myself. Self-control.
Do you think that and one of the things with this list too, like patience, kindness, gentleness, self-control, it strikes me that these are listed because they're things that are easy to fail in. I
Oh,
think by
yeah.
nature, I was kind of joking about this thing with you on a call with you yesterday, but like by nature, I'm kind of violent. I like violence. It's fun for me. But I
Right.
don't mean that like hopefully not in an extreme way, but like it's like combats, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But it's actually that's not good per se. I think you need to have the be able to defend people. I get that.
The martial virtues and that
Right,
sort
there are
of thing.
martial virtues, but I mean, being a peacemaker seems tough. Joy seems tough. It's easier to be grumpy about life. Love seems real tough. Patience is hard when things don't go your way. Kindness is hard because, I mean, kindness is a perennial fruit of the spirit. Like, you can't not be kind and be a Christian. That's a contradiction in terms. Gentleness is a perennial virtue of fruit of the Holy Spirit, rather. So is self-control. And if you have these things, there's nothing really, there's no law because you're doing the right thing. And if you belong to Christ Jesus, you've really crucified the flesh with its passions and desires, which are then defined at the top of the list in verses, I guess, 18 and following, or I guess 19 and following, more 19
Yeah,
and following. So there's sexual morality, impurity, sensuality. Okay, that makes sense. Idolatry, sorcery, enmity, strife, jealousy. So enmity is this kind of vice of fightingness. Strife is pretty obvious as well. Jealousy, wishing that you had what other people had. Fits of anger, frustration, and anger at people that that you feel like mistreated you. Rivalries. Sometimes that's called tribalism today, but apparently that's good now. I understand. Obviously, everyone has. Don't mishear me. Everyone has a group. I'm not saying that, but
yeah,
it's just funny how like the virtues and vices get switched around. But actually, factionism, like in First John, for example, is viewed very negatively. Same within Second Peter and Jude. Factionalism is not a good thing.
yeah,
Rivalries are not a good thing because you're supposed to treat others as better than yourself. The disagreement with John Mark and the Apostle Paul, well, I guess Barnabas technically about John Mark, in Acts is not viewed as a virtuous thing. God
right.
may have used it for good. Dissensions, divisions are actually bad. You don't divide. Like it to me, we somehow misunderstand these things. Envy is kind of straightforward. Drunkenness is straightforward. Orgies, yeah, well, I mean, that's bad.
That's a thing.
Um, and things like these.
Yeah, don't go to the Diddy parties.
Don't go to those. Yes, or the Epstein Island or whatever.
Right.
Um, so, anyways, here's look at this at verse 21 though. I warn you, as I warned you before, that those who do such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. You can do all that. You can do all these things. You can create divisions, envy, violence, power, all this kind of stuff you want, and you can gain a kingdom here, but you're not going to gain the kingdom of God. I think there's like a real warning here,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
you can create these divisions. To kind of go back on topic for a moment here, you can have these divisions that are, the bad boomers or the bad Christians here or the bad set of evangelicals or the good set of Protestants. And then you end up becoming like the cool kids club or the elitist club,
yeah,
and everyone else doesn't get it. Like the hidden, I've seen this before, like the hidden reformed teaching that no one knew on this minor detail on, like, I don't know, salvation. You're like, oh, you didn't know this because of X or Y scholastic distinction, and therefore everyone else is an idiot. It's just at one
yes.
level you have to realize, all right, just chill out, dude.
Yeah,
um,
and it's fair to say that it goes the other direction as well, which is to
yes.
say, uh, it's also the case that all those vices, we're talking about this because of, largely because there's there's a world of discourse that can kind of float in our heads, and you see this discourse largely on Twitter and that sort of thing. But it is also very much the case that discourse goes the other direction, and you
Mm,
mentioned it a bit, Wyatt, which is, yeah, you can have the previous generation also looking at the new generation. It's like, oh, look at all the kids these days with their purple hair and tattoos, and it's just sort of like you've given up. You've given up on, the kids are disappointing. The next generation, and they're just going to make it all. They all voted for Kamala Harris. What's going to, that sort of thing, and you can lose again as well there.
you can lose in every direction. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
not.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
and you can lose. Yeah, you can lose. I think it's one thing. This is one thing in those passages in the Bible, right? When it says wives, comma, and husbands, comma. One thing William Goode used to do when he taught through that was like, cover your eyes if you're a husband and you see the wives thing. Cover your eyes if you're a wife and you see the husband's thing, because that's not for you. Focus on your thing. So one thing I could say is, if I'm talking to Gen Z, you could say, be very careful about these attitudes towards boomers or whatever.
Right.
If you were talking to boomers, one thing you would want to say is be very
100%.
careful about the alienating. Be very careful about the fact is people are tempted to be everything we're saying in this episode, and you can help that. You can be a stumbling block toward
Right.
people giving into those kinds of vices. And one
Right.
thing that all mentors have to be. So a good example that's thrown out around there, and I think yeah, I think this is worth maybe as we draw toward a close. One application worth bringing up is there's a lot of questions floating around the kind of the Gen Z world, right? About like, there's our Overton window and the Overton window on like talking about race and Jews and all that kind of thing. Very, 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 very different, and for good reason. And on the one hand, I'd say people that just don't have a background where it's don't judge the generation that's very sensitive about those topics. Maybe that's not just because of the post-war fill in the blank with all these things. Maybe there's something good underneath that attachment to those subjects that's not merely ideological, but that has been ideologicalized perhaps. Be very, very careful because a lot is at stake. On the other hand, it is also useful if you can get the guy who can feel the deep attachment to those things. I care very much about recognizing the impact of slavery. I care very much about recognizing what went on in the Holocaust, those sorts of things. But I can also develop the skill to feel very deeply about that, but also be untriggered when kind of the dumb. I don't want to say it that way because I don't want to say people are dumb because they're not. It's a disinformation problem. No, that's not even the way to put it. See Dale and I's episode on epistemic abuse. It's that problem.
See that episode. See
episode on epistemic abuse. That's my diagnosis of what's going on here. But because of that, I think there's real compassion to be had about people asking those questions.
Right.
And actually, you do need a handful of people who are untriggered and able to handle it.
And, even to add what you're saying, there are real generational blind spots, problems. I think some of the financial concerns that Gen Z and millennials have,
Yes.
based on how prior generations lived, are real. Sometimes in church life, you'll find that baby boomers, largely because of their context, became a little bit more like coaches because they had all these churches that exploded after World War II and kind of came in to take over the initial pastor's job. And so they never had to do some of the more difficult theological work that is required in an age where church decline is now happening. So those would be like blind spots. So then the advice given sometimes is unrealistic to younger people in ministry, just for example. So there's real things like this. And I think you can bring those up and be honest about them. I just think you still have to avoid the sort of despairing bitterness that could arise from those sorts of comments in whatever direction you're in. The one thing I do want to say, though, you mentioned that older people shouldn't look down on people with blue hair, but I would say for sure that you should. Yeah, that's the... No, sorry.
I mean...
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I was just...
Yeah.
I think the boomers are probably okay. I think they're going to have a problem. I looked at some of the retirement data, and the average saving of a baby boomer, so who's at retirement age, it's going to be a crisis.
Yeah.
They didn't save.
Yeah, and
they went on cruises.
And now we just don't have anything to save. So that's where that's our.
We got to pay for the Social Security or whatever, right? So I think it's going to be.
Yeah, they are okay. Yeah, that's really what we're trying to get at. I think is like this isn't really about one generation being better than the other, and part of it is actually the relativization of it. It is to say there's virtues here that we've declined from, and that it would be good to get from your grandpa and your parents, and it's good for them to learn things from you. And that I'm not trying to just be kumbaya here. I think that's actually just real, and you can point plausibly to many reality confirming examples in both directions, and that's really, I'm not sure it doesn't always work a little bit that way, and there's virtues to be had in that always working that way. This is just what it looks like for us. If those weren't the problems, what would there be no problems? Again, what do you expect?
Which is a title of a marriage book. What did you expect? I think we did it, Joe. I think we did it. I sound like Kamala Harris. We did it, Joe.
We did it.
President and vice president. Okay, that sounds good. I I think we'll stop here. The baby boomers are probably okay, but so are Gen Z. We like them all. Apparently, millennials are the bad guys, but I'm a millennial, so I feel like we're the best.
It takes them all to make America great again. So, you know.
There you go. That's the way to end this. Mega. Okay. Bye.
Bye.
I like how we ended with Mega. That's nice.